So this was an interesting decision. I'm redoing coverage on Twilight Struggle. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. Twilight Struggle was one of the very first games that I covered. I did my little playthrough on the 7 days systems. I did Brass, Endeavor, a couple of others, and I said, hey, I want to try these CDG type things. This is the one I started with. I didn't know a lot about them at that point. I'd known I had played a couple of them a long time ago that I didn't really like too much, but I wanted to give this a try. How could a game be #1 on Board Game Geek if it wasn't particularly good? And, well, I think I came out with a lukewarm sort of assessment of the game in the long run. After that one play. I played it a couple more times afterwards, immediately, had a little bit better view of it, but never got around to doing another playthrough, which I had intended to do from the very first. Now, since that time, I've added a lot of games to my collection, and I've added all my old games back to my locality, so it's been harder to replay games that, you know, I may want to play again right away. But in this particular case, I think I kind of owe it both to the ranking on the game and also to the fact that I'm sitting on it at 2d6.org. I've had a copy of this ready to be published. I've published all the other older stuff, but I felt, man, you know, you can't do this with the #1 ranked game. At the very least, even if my impressions don't change terribly much, I think my camera work has gotten a little bit better, a little bit less of that dizziness going on. People seem to think it was shakiness at first. No, the shakiness is fine. You're seeing that right now. The problem was I didn't look through the camera as I panned, and I've gotten a little bit better about panning since then, even if I don't look through the camera. All right, so I am going to go through kind of a complete introduction about the game. I've already gone through some of it there as to why I'm even doing it. But I am going to go through the rules briefly just to help refresh myself and to maybe make some commentary on them as I go. So, first of all, this is, of course, the deluxe version. The map board itself, what do you have on it? Well, you have a number of different states with boxes for the two different players to put influence that they've got in those different locations. Yeah, that's probably... the states are connected through lines to show where influence spreads, as it were, kind of like in a Pax Britannica type game. And you know what's kind of interesting? Freedom in the Galaxy, which I just recently did, kind of reminds me of this in some ways. Not in the CDG sense of it at all, but in the influence on locations and such not, and kind of trying to create a groundswell in your favor. It's not terribly much like Twilight Struggle, but I think it helped ease me into actually doing this. So, we also have some of the states are purple, which means they're battleground states. That means if there's a coup performed in them, it affects the DEFCON status. The little numbers here, I think those are initial setup. Yeah, those are initial setup values for the beginning of the game, although there are optional rules for other situations. You track DEFCON status. If it goes to nuclear war, the person who caused that loses the game. It also has some effects on where you can and cannot throw coups, and those are spelled out here. There's these little markers to indicate that. Each turn, each player is responsible for committing as many military operations worth of points as the current DEFCON status, which means, wow, if we're up at peace, you've got to do a lot of military. And chances are that'll lower the DEFCON, so you can kind of reach somewhere in the middle. This is to indicate how many cards have been played as you go. At the beginning of the game, you're going to have less cards in your hand to begin with, which don't know if that's spelled out here, how many cards you get. But you also have less action rounds that you actually have to commit to. So at the beginning of the game, you only each do 6 action rounds, and I think you start off, I don't remember how many cards. That's spelled out somewhere in these rules. Let's see. It's 8 cards on the first 3 turns, and on the rest of the game, the hand size will be 9. But also on the first 3 turns, you only get 6 action rounds, and for the rest of the game, you're going to get 7. And so the largest factor in this game is that you're going to be triggering these scoring rounds, and that's very familiar from the old Game Summit, and I talked about that, I'm sure, in my first review. It's a very similar type of aspect. There are some cards hidden in the decks, and in the first deck, that's Europe, Mid-East. Let's see, are there others? Yeah, Asia, right at the top. Europe, Mid-East, and Asia will get scored. And you get scored for having either a presence in the region, dominance of the region, or control of the region. Now, those are specified, let's look at the scoring area, by different, as a set of different values. Now, do they give it here? Yeah, they cheat it here. They give it to you on the cheat sheet. So presence is just having control of one of the territories in the region. Domination is controlling more countries and more battleground countries than your opponent. And you have to have at least one of each. And then the final is absolute control. You have to control more of the countries and all battleground countries in the region. And then you'll get points based on the little charts in each region. And those little charts are different for each region. Southeast Asia is a special little scoring card in addition to the Asia card, which comes out only in the middle deck and has certain specific things. 1 victory point for each of these areas and 2 for Thailand. Just a special bonus scoring round in there. Notably, control of all of Europe, Eastern and Western, and that's really a division for some cards and for setup, gives you a win if a scoring card comes up at that point. And at the very end of the game, each of the regions, except the Southeast Asia, will be scored again, which means you could win automatically by controlling Europe at that point. In addition to when a scoring round happens, each battleground country gives you an extra victory point. And each enemy country adjacent to the enemy superpower, or each country adjacent to the enemy superpower that you control, gives you a point. So, for example, if the U.S. player controls Finland, that's adjacent. If the Russian player controls Cuba, that's worth a point. All right. So that's kind of your main goal in the way that you normally score points. There are other ways to score points. You can score points off this little space race track. The little values listed here. So the first person to get to this space will get 2 points. When the second person gets there, though, he takes a point back. Here, only the first person counts, etc. as we go on. There are other advantages to the space track. And there are cards that will generate points as well, just on a kind of one-turn basis. Another way to get points is if your opponent hasn't done military operations, you get a point at the end of his turn if he has not done this required amount. Now, this is just a zero-sum game. If you gain a point, that means you're moving down your side of the track. If the other guy gains a point, it's moving away from your side of the track. Let's see if we've got the sequence of play here. Okay, so let's look very briefly at the sequence of play and kind of what goes on. A little bit into the details. I probably went more into the details last time I played, but here I'm just kind of refreshing it into my own head to get myself better feel for the situation and maybe talk a little bit about the player aid card, which I don't think I talked enough about. Increased DEFCON status. At the beginning of each turn, if the DEFCON's been dropped, things kind of get a little bit more peaceful by 1 level. You deal out the hand of cards to each player. And then here comes the headline phase. Each person is going to have cards in their hands, and they get to choose one card that they're going to trigger for the event. Now, whoever plays the higher higher operational value to their headline card, and this is like any CDG where they have the ops in the event, whoever plays the higher operations value, their event triggers first. You can play an opponent's event in this place, and it just is a way to get that event into play, essentially. That's usually you want to play your own events here, but sometimes maybe it's better to play the other players. Now, after that, you'll be going to the actual action rounds, where you take turns playing cards like in any CDG type game, and you turn it up, and you can play it either for the event or for the operations. Hey, that sounds pretty normal. But if it's an opponent's event, and this is kind of the cute little twist to this game that I really like, and I think it also happens in 1960, which I actually prefer to this by a little bit, but that may be because I don't like thinking as much and I find it more fun. If it's your opponent's event, you play it for the operations point and it triggers the opponent's event. And you get to choose the order amongst those. So that's kind of a nice situation where you can't avoid your opponent's events by playing for operations points, and you're always faced with a hard choice with every card. You're always faced with a choice, at least. Do you want the event? Do you want the operations? Do you want the operations at the cost of giving them to your opponent as the event, giving the opponent his event? How much choice do you have? Well, not a lot. You've got to play the cards you've got to play for the action round. So if you've got cards you don't really want to come out, you have to play them. Now, you have some options of ways to bury cards. One of them is you can burn them in the space track, and another one is you can hold them from turn to turn. Of course, holding your opponent's event from turn to turn may have some disadvantages. It's taking up a slot of a card that could be very useful for you to hold as a reserve, as a, wow, I need this card to react to an opponent's action. I don't remember there being a lot of interrupt cards. There may have been some. We'll see as we go along. Okay, so the biggest thing here, though, is what can you do with your operations points? Because the events you're just drawing and you're taking the instructions involved in the event. And that's how these CDGs enable themselves to have very, very, very many rich, different options going on without too many rules, because the rules are embedded actually on the cards. So you have a sequence of different operations you can do, and the first and sort of simplest is placing influence markers, where you'll be putting down little white side markers to indicate they're unestablished. This is kind of like a Pax Britannica type thought here, that you need established markers somewhere in order to place unestablished ones adjacent. So wherever you have established markers, you can place unestablished ones, and you can also place them adjacent to that. So I could place into any of these locations. I can also, of course, place into, right off the line off my major power as well. But there are a significant amount of established influence markers on the play at the beginning of the game, for example, in the UK there, which can spread into Europe, and there's also 7 more in Western Europe, so that you can set yourself up so you have the ability to play in a lot of areas right from the beginning of the game. And this is just a matter of, it costs you 1 operations to place an influence marker, unless the enemy controls that territory. Now, how does the enemy control that territory? The enemy controls a territory by having more value and stability than you do. Established. Established? No, not established in total. So, for example, in this case, if there were already 3 Russian points, and say they weren't established yet, what the hell? Well, let me make sure that's right. It costs 1 to place. Yeah, it's by action round, so these would already be established by this point. So here, the Russians are already ahead of me by enough that they're in control. Those are going to cost me double to put in. So I could put one in for 2 operations points, but now I'm no longer, it's no longer controlled by the enemy. So now they only cost me 1 each. So you end up in this kind of little bidding war. And again, 1960 and Divided Republic both take that kind of concept of, you've got control, it's going to be harder to even contest this. And of course, they're both derived heavily from this game. Okay. So that's basically what you're going to be being able to do with placing influence markers. The next option is realignment rolls. And you can only use your operations points for one of these actions, but you can spread them out. So placing influence markers, you can place them across the board, across the globe, but that's all you can do. You can't do them and this and that. No. So realignment rolls cost an operations point each. And here, you're going to be facing someone else who has influence in the target country. You'll each roll a die, and whoever gets the higher roll can remove the difference between their rolls in the influence from the 2 countries. Now, you get bonuses, however, on your die roll for each adjacent, and both players do, for each adjacent controlled country, if it's adjacent to your superpower, or if you have more influence in the target country itself than your opponent. And you're just going to make a roll off and see if you can reduce the value there. And you get to do that as many times as you have operations points, and you can do it in different countries. The next option is coups, which is kind of similar to this. Here you're trying to reduce enemy influence in a country and perhaps add your own to that country. The opponent has to have influence marker there. It costs you an entire card. Now the stability of the target, the value up here in the corner, which is what you're trying to exceed your opponent in to get control, the stability of your opponent times 2 is the number that you have to exceed. And you'll be rolling a die and adding the operations points on your card to this. If your die roll is greater than this doubled stability number, you've got a coup that's successful. And for each point that it's greater, you remove an opponent's influence marker. If the opponent no longer has any influence markers, you get to add your own. So this is a slightly different situation. You're not risking things here in the way that you are in a realignment roll. However, you can gain from this as well, which you can't do in a realignment roll. Now, when you do a coup, the size of your card gets added to your required military operations, which causes some bonuses. Of course, you're restricted where you can do coups by DEFCON, and if you do a coup in a purple area, battleground state, you drop the DEFCON by 1. If you drop it down to nuclear war, hey, you just lost the game. Cool. The final thing that you can do with your card, that I can think of, is you can throw it into the space race up here. And I haven't really paid too much attention to how that works. You're allowed to do, I believe, 1 card per turn in this case. And you have to discard a card of at least the size indicated for the space that you're trying to increase into. At that point, you roll a die to see if you make it in. So here I'd have to throw a 2 ops card, and I'd have to roll a 1 through 3 to make it to that next level. And if I do, I push forward into that, assuming I'm the US. We got these little markers. Second card played. What? Is there a first card played? There we go. That indicates that I've already played my 1 card for the turn. Now there's a possibility that you're allowed to play 2 cards for a turn in the space race. That can happen once you send Fido into space. Or Reagan or whatever. Bozo, something. And there's advantages from getting the space race. I won't go into too much detail with them, but one of them is the victory points, and the other is you get certain special advantages that you get during play if you're the only person who's reached that space. And that's really about it, except for a couple of little other things. We got the China card here. The China card sits in somebody's hand, and it's a face-up option to use. But if you use it, it flips over and goes to the other player. Now, it's a big 4-point event card, or operations card, and it also gives you certain certain bonuses to the operation, +1 if you use all your points in Asia, and +1 victory point if you're holding on to it at the end of the game. I think I already mentioned there's going to be a final scoring round at the end of the game, in which case holding Europe can win you the game at that point as well. I'm going to be playing with, as I tend to like to do, the Chinese Civil War, and also all the optional cards, which may or may not destabilize play. Who cares? The Chinese Civil War is a situation where there's a number of events which cannot be played while the Chinese Civil War is in existence. In particular, you cannot play Red Scare Purge nor Cultural Revolution. Those are restrictions on the Soviets. And the U.S. can't play the Formosa Resolution until the Chinese Civil War has been resolved. There are some cards, in particular, Nixon plays the China card and the Ussuri River Skirmish, that it's assumed the U.S. will be holding the China card until Russia resolves until the Soviets resolve that. Now, how does Soviets resolve it? Well, they resolve it by throwing 3 influence into the Chinese Civil War. So basically, it's a drain of their initial point value. I think the assumption is that the Soviet player had a slight advantage in the game, draining a few points off them, but not forcing them to resolve this. It gives them a flexibility and helps even the game out a little bit. I don't know, but I like it because it is correct to assume that China was a problem for Russia at that point. I also like the way the China card flips back and forth. One of the things you're going to have to worry about always is what you want to do with your points. How can you best, effect getting your better score with the scoring cards that you know are in hand? Is it by placing influence markers where you just score points and kind of spread your ability to react later? Or how much of it is through realignment rolls, which to me seem kind of dangerous, or coups, which are risky, but you kind of have to do them to score this. Now, some cards can give you those military operations too. You have the option to burn events that you don't like of your opponent in the space race. And potentially, later on, you have the option to burn them if you succeed well enough in the space race. Anyway, I was hoping to talk a little bit more about the thought process involved in these. But whatever was coming to mind before sort of isn't right now. Maybe it'll come out during play, maybe not. I don't know. It's just sort of a matter of, I think this deserved another play and another look in terms of a full review side of it. Maybe my thoughts will be a little different. I'd guess, actually, I'd rather see... I'm thinking that my original thoughts are probably more coherent and more telling than what I'll come up with now. But we'll see. It's always hard to tell. All right, we'll send this one up.